On the phone the whole time. I mean, they're constantly ringing you up and saying,
got any statement to make? Well, you said this here, but, you know, try to trap you into, or extend you into saying more and more and more, like secret police do everywhere. I mean, these reporters, same sort of technique. So.
And did you get much support from the department and staff?
No. Some persons, I went to see a number of them, like Manning Clark, the historian, and some people were very nice and sympathetic, like Richard Story, the Japanese specialist, and I went to see C.P. Fitzgerald, the sinologist, and I mean, everybody talked to everybody. I knew it was so tiny in those days, and I knew a lot about China through that. But my anthropologist, Nadil, really washed his hands on it, de facto. Wouldn't do anything. Wouldn't make any statement of any kind. I think Firth just found me a most dreadful embarrassment. And Jean, what is her name? She later became Professor of Social Administration in Melbourne. Well, Jean, damn it. I was poverty-stricken. We were the poorest people in Australia, ANU research student. We didn't even qualify for income tax. We were forced to live in the university hostel to keep them full, which took something like 3/4 of our income. So we had no money, and I had agreed, Jean Craig, her name was then. She later married a now eminent historian, and became professor herself, and he became a professor. She had hired me as an interviewer for a project she was doing in Sydney. I've forgotten what it was. It was a sociological project, and she was absolutely. I was poverty-stricken. We were the poorest people in Australia, ANU research student. We didn't even qualify for income tax. We were forced to live in the university hostel to keep them full, which took something like 3/4 of our income. So we had no money, and I had agreed, Jean Craig, her name was then. She later married a now eminent historian, and became professor herself, and he became a professor. She had hired me as an interviewer for a project she was doing in Sydney. I've forgotten what it was. It was a sociological project, and she was absolutely furious when the news broke, and she said, "Do you realise that by making this public stir, you are prejudicing my research project?" And I couldn't believe my ears that anybody confronted with a tremendous attack on free speech should be concerned about her wretched little research project. Well, that was so. One didn't get an awful lot of support from senior colleagues. In fact, none. You had to fight it yourself. However, Freddie Rose said, "Look," he said, "why don't you go and study the Australian Aborigines? They're on the mainland. They live in reservations, reserves, but," he says, "it's very much more difficult to stop you going to a reserve." So he said, "Go to Groote Eylandt, where I was." I said, "Okay." Wrote off to the protector of Aborigines, Fred Gray. Interesting story. He'd been a pearler. The war came along, the pearling industry stopped. So Fred got himself, he had used Aborigines who were living in the bush, fishing for pearls, send them down, bring them up. And when that business ceased, he had a yacht, a lugger. He gathered these Aborigines into a place on Umbacumber on Groote Eylandt and erected a settlement of Aborigines, and before long he was recognised by the Australian state as the protector of Aborigines for Umbacumber, with no qualifications, no legitimacy whatsoever. There was a mission down the other end of the island, CMS, which is Church of England. So, and the next stage is he gets financial support from the Australian state in the form of welfare payments for the Aborigines. But since they were not citizens, but dependents, wards of the state, and he was the protector, the money was paid to him. So he's got a nice income coming in. He also made him work, fishing, producing food, building dams, and collecting shells, which were converted into necklaces and dyed, very pretty, and sold in Sydney down south for large sums of money in the big department stores. So there was an economic base there. So he was the protector of Aborigines. Fred was a friend of his from the seaplane days. wrote and said, this Peter Worsley's all right, let him in, he's a serious anthropologist. And Fred said, okay, come. So I went. And we got on all right. At one point when he was beating young boys, because some of them had stolen some turkey eggs out of the sheds they had there, I remonstrated. I said, I thought this was really too much for a minor offence like that. I mean, in any case, I didn't like kids being beaten up by grown men. He told me to get the hell off the island. An experience that most anthropologists go through. Some official or other told them to get the hell out. And I said, I'm not going. So I stayed and it all cooled down and I finished. But you see, having been an Africanist and then having converted myself within, what, less than a year into a New Guinea Islander, which I really knew very little about, and so did anybody else. Then, overnight, I had to become an Australian Aboriginalist. Well, you will know Australian Aborigines are difficult people because they have these wretched kinship systems. And I found that it was curious. I didn't know what I was going to study when I went there. Fred Rose had studied the kinship system, and it's like a magnet, an intellectual magnet. You cannot study anything else. It is so challenging and so difficult that I had to do that, and that's what I focused upon. Later, Stanner, who was my thesis supervisor, said he was thinking of forming an elite group of people that knew about Australian kinship systems. And there would only be about 15, and they would meet once a year and have a dinner. And I can understand that attitude because it is arcane in the extreme. But I think I cracked it. You don't want to go into this, do you?
Yes, yes.
Oh, well. Well, Fred Rose's book, which is a classic, she argues that he doesn't bother much with anybody else's approach except his own. He's a most monomanic also guy. I mean, he's kept on studying them for, since 1938 through to the present day, and he's written several books and about the Groote Eylandt, Wandeliagwa, and other Aboriginal groups. Just as Evans Pritchard went on writing about the Noor for a couple of decades. But I haven't got that. I like to move on to something new. Now, Fred had argued that the orthodox approach to Australian systems was algebraic, as that Radcliffe Brown put it. That it could be reduced to a formula. A1 equals B1, B and the children of them are C2. You know, the classic formulae for 4-section and 8-section systems. And that's, I always found that difficult because I've been demathematicized by this Catholic background. However, Fred took a completely different approach. He said, it's not algebra. He said, let's look at them existentially, on the ground, if you like. And if you look at the structure of the society, all power is in the hands of the older men. In fact, young men were not allowed to marry until they reached the age of about 27, 28, 29. And then they were handed over some old hag. The cast-off of these older men who appropriated all the younger, beautiful, nubile women. There were also many other mechanisms for keeping them in a condition of inferiority, status inferiority. In fact, I almost laugh when I read about 19th century accounts of Australian Aboriginal society as communist and egalitarian, because I mean it's riven through with two gross structural inequalities, not of class, they're classless all right, those of age and those of sex, gender. Women are excluded from the crucial decision making, and young men are kept in their place by God. Now all this has been classically shown in Hart and Pilling's wonderful book on the Tiwi. But Fred's approach to the kinship system per se was somewhat different. He hadn't got the insight that Hart and Pilling had, because he didn't work through the language for one thing. I did. Quite good at linguistics, and luckily, though I'd picked what Capel, the reader at Sydney in linguistics, said was one of the 5 most difficult languages in Australia out of 500 odd.
Gosh.
It had in some respects certain structural properties which were unlike Bantu, noun classes. So I could click into it. And I did publish in Oceania a comparative study of Bantu noun classes and Ndliakwa noun classes and Nungabuyo, Australian noun classes. So I was quite good at that. And it enabled me too to work through the language. But nevertheless, I basically followed Fred's methods, and I only had 10 months, 11 months in the field, with no preparation whatsoever, working on this ghastly difficult topic. And what Fred argued was that power is concentrated. It was a gerontocracy. And to understand the system, you had to see that women were pawns to be bestowed and manipulated. And that the logic of algebra couldn't work. Because the correct person to marry was your mother's mother's brother's daughter's daughter. Now, if you look at it demographically, this is a population of 450 people, very often there aren't any mother's mother's brother's daughters available or alive. They don't exist. So then you have to marry somebody who else. And that means you've got to change that area of the kinship terminology. Because you're now, might be, marrying a woman even called your mother. So that produced constant realignments of kinship terms. And therefore the system was all out of kilter. It was not pure algebra. It wasn't an integral, logical, coherent and persisting system. Due to demographic variability, if no other thing. Now, later, and other anthropologists like Hart and Pilling and Lester Hyatt and others have shown that what I didn't even get onto, there's also a process of the politics of bestowal, as it's called, that the older, senior elders use women to reward complaisant young men. And that they also use them in ways which got nothing to do with the pure logic of the kinship system. So that also causes a disequilibrium, a lack of... This argument goes on. There's been a subsequent man who worked on Grotana called David Turner, English guy now in Toronto, who, he, however, went back to the beginning and produced algebra, a beautiful, coherent, interlocking system, which I don't believe in. So we now have Fred's account of the Wandel-Yagua kinship system, we have my account of the Wandel-Yagua kinship system, we have David Turner's account of the Wandel-Yagua system, and there are a couple of other minor ones, all different. And I think it's a perfect text for somebody to come along and do a definitive cutting of the Gordian knot of comparative study. Jocelyn de Jong tried something like this a few years ago in an extended article in Taal London book, what's it called? Kunde. So I studied the kinship system. En passant, I was interested in all dimensions of the life of these people. Incredibly rich. I mean, you know, a culture of 450 people is a culture. A very, very, very complex culture. Burns, Kathleen and Ronald, the great ethnographers of Australia, have written almost a book a year since decades, recorded part of one of the ritual cycles, of which there are many other kinds of cycles amongst one of the Arnhem Land peoples, in two books, Jangawul and Gunapipi. It's only a segment, showing the most incredibly complex myths of the dream time, of the creation of the world, of the movements of the spirits and the persons who populated the earth at the beginning. It's the order of complexity of what's his name's work on the Dogon. Griol and Ditolan, yes. That order of complexity. Now these are hunting and collecting people. Many people think of as savages, living like animals, and, you know, close to nature. Incredibly sophisticated cosmological systems. And I couldn't penetrate into that, alas, because I wasn't allowed to go to the mission, because I was regarded as a dangerous red by the missionaries, where most of the ritual specialists were. My people knew about as much about their own religion as the average Church of England attender at church on a Sunday morning knows about transubstantiation. Nothing. At least they said they weren't. But I did work on some other areas, one of which I'm turning back to now. I would have some very negative things to say about the CMS mission, which also was singularly ineffective. I think the first recruit to the Church of England came after 20 years of a missionary endeavour. They were very puritanical. I remember when they used to visit us, we used to wear, like the Aborigines, just strips of cloth around here called nagas. It was scandalous. Heathenism, regression, atavistic. So when their missionaries came, we used to put trousers on. And they were not interested, as far as I could see, in any degree in Aboriginal culture, simply in replacing it by their own. Now, I have a deep apology to make to them, however, because in the last few weeks there has appeared one of the most marvellous books in anthropology. It could only have been written probably by a missionary. You and I go in for a year or two. In Evans Pritchard's case, or Margaret Mead's case, a few months. These people live there for 10, 15 years, and a woman called Dr. Julie Waddy has just produced under ANU auspices 2 volumes of the knowledge of the plants and animals by the Aborigines of Groote Eylandt, which is superb. She's a trained biologist. She has mastered thoroughly the anthropological literature and the philosophical literature on the issues raised by problems of scientific taxonomies. It's a wonderful book. And I don't think that any anthropologist, unless they're one of these people that goes back constantly, as some do, over a decade or so, could possibly produce that kind of work, the depth and the range of it. And it's a huge breakthrough for any studies, not only in Australia. And but I, with modesty, pioneered that field. I was very interested in what they knew. Because I got a great shock one day. I asked the kids there was a school where they taught them nothing except catechism and hymn singing. But I gave them a test one day. I said, please draw me. They knew what the shape of the island was like on a map, because there were some around. I gave them outlines of the island. I said, please draw on it whatever you think would be of interest about this island. And its natural features or whatever, I leave it to you. I was absolutely amazed. To us, that island is featureless. It does have tracks, and there is a hill or two and a billabong, and nothing very much. It's just nothing man-made, of course. And these maps came back from the kids crisscrossed with lines. I said, what the hell are they? They said they're roads. Roads. To them, the entire island was intimately dissected and made of known tracks and divisions. Whereas to me it was just an area of bush. And I started thinking about their perceptions of the natural environment. And I went back through all my notes and I started prodding them, asking them about plants and animals and their associations and what names they used for them and what connections they saw in the ecological contexts and how. And later on I wrote an article about it. Amateur, but I got very excited by pure coincidence. Well, coincidence being a communist and talking to a communist linguist, Peter Wexler, who had been at Cambridge with me. He said, we read this guy Vygotsky. So I read Vygotsky. Nothing to do with Groote Eylandt, I thought. But just about, it's in the Piaget mode, about the formation of concepts amongst the young children. And I thought, my heavens, this is the key to the problem I've been battling with on Groote Eylandt, where I found that there wasn't a unitary system of cognition or of taxonomy about animals and plants. Though you could ask them, if you like, they had got a scientific or a pragmatic material system. They also had a way of classifying according to the relation, the connection of these animals in mythology with them, as they occurred in myths, which were attached to particular clans. So that was a function of the social structure, as it were, utterly different from the kind of, what might I say, ethno-scientific one. And thirdly, there was the intra-myth connections of how Stingray in the creation time, the dawn time, moved around the island, stopped at certain points, met other animals and marine creatures, and they occur together in a myth. And that is the unifying frame. But there are 3 frames. The social structural frame of the clan, there's the intra-myth connections, religious if you like, mythology, and there is the framework of scientific analysis, which also has two dimensions, because it's also, they distinguish things that are relevant to them, that is, those things they can eat and those things they can't eat. So Julie Waddy, I worked this out quite well, as it turns out, aided, thank God, by Vygotsky. Wrote it in a Hungarian journal, which I did because I was still loyal, but that was just about the time of the Hungarian Revolution, and I blew up. And
it was in Hungarian or in...
It was in English.
Mm.
Edmund used to use it a lot at Cambridge. He was a great admirer of that article.
Edmund Leach.
Edmund Leach.
Mm.
I was, as a result of that, due to go to Hungary. I was going to the World Congress of Sociology at Stresa in 1958, something like that. And I was due to go on. I went by motorbike to Hungary. But just before I left, the Hungarian Revolution had started, and I couldn't stand that. So we all formed part of the new resistance inside the Communist Party, which later gave rise to a journal called the Reasoner, which is an opposition journal, then the New Reasoner, and eventually it became fused with New University's Left Review and became New Left Review. So I was one of the founding fathers. I was an editor of the New Reasoner, which is a superb journal, still is. When I look at it, and though I have very little in common with the current New Left Review, I am a founding father. And why did I start talking about it all there?
You were
Hungary.
on your way to Hungary.
I was on my way to Hungary. So I withdrew. I was going to Hungary to give 2 talks.
Was Hungary the first great shock? I mean,
to me it was, yeah.
I mean, Stalin was still not unmasked by this time.
Not to me. It was no. We all have our capacity for self-delusion, you know. No.
So it seemed to be going all right, and then Hungary came.
Yes. And so I withdrew my... I was due to give 2 talks in Budapest, but I withdrew them. I said, I'm not coming. So I never heard a word from them again. Except I did receive a telegram from my contact out there, was Tibor Bodrogi, who was at the museum and edited this Acta Ethnographica, saying I'd sent him a message, a telegram during the height of the uprising, wishing them revolutionaries, withdrawing my thing and saying that I identified thoroughly with the revolution. And I got to myself, I didn't know how he would react to that. Probably nothing, silence. And I got a very moving telegram back saying, we are deeply appreciative of your solidarity.
I mean, I know too little about it, but looking from the outside, you saw what I would have imagined one would have seen was a Russia which one still believed in, threatened by subversion of one of its satellites. Why did you identify with the revolution?
Well, what everyone's attitude to Russia, it was patently a massively popular revolution against all kinds of horrors, which very rapidly became patent and explicit. And
one could see that from here at that time.
Oh yes,
looking back
yes. Well, somebody like Dora Scarlett, for example, went out there, I think, for the Daily Worker as a reporter, immediately, and been imprisoned for many years. First she knew about the Hungarian uprising was when she saw the courtyard in the prison was full of statues of Stalin. Had been removed from public places. That was at the time when Khrushchev started. So we revolted with the Hungarians, and the scale of it, I mean, was gigantic. It clearly was an incredibly popular revolution. And then we started asking questions. Why? What was wrong with our Marxism? What was wrong with the Soviet Union? And that sparked off the whole explosion of the New Left. And it was a massive movement, you know. The New Left was a very significant factor in its day. You don't want me to go into this?
Yes.
Well, the New Left Review today, in my view, is a Mandarin journal, specialising, although it's improved greatly in the last year or two under Robin Blackburn, but under Perry Anderson's aegis, and I have the deepest intellectual and scholarly respect for Perry. I think he's not far short of a genius given his years. I think his historical works are wonderful. What he did with New Left Review, however, was to convert it from a journal of mass movement into a very arid esoteric journal, which could only really be comprehended if you had a PhD from the Sorbonne. New Left Review was important not only because we had at one time 40 or 50, what do we call them? They were usually focused around coffee clubs and cafes, and we had used to have them at the Marquee and 100 Oxford Street jazz clubs, and they were very popular supporters groups. And we used to go all over the country talking to them. And there was a movement, because not just us, but it was also the time of the beginnings of CND. And we immediately identified as CND. And we indeed wrote, I've just written an article about this too. It's coming out shortly by Verso, by New Left, on the origins of the New Left. We became very prominent and intellectually significant in formulating many of the policies and ideas of the what was the biggest mass movement since the Chartists. So it was big stuff. It was a popular movement, and for the first, under Stuart Hall's editorship of New Left Review, which ran up to about, I think, number 20 or something like that, the journal reflected that character. It was concerned with popular issues about what's happening to British society. It was concerned with cultural issues which had never been talked about by Stalinists. And that's where we made contact with Raymond Williams and Richard Hoggart. And we used to have art discussions and movies and everything. The whole of human life was there. And people liked it. It made a tremendous impact. And then, I think very bitterly, and Edward Thompson has said this in his Poverty of Theory book on Althusser, it was converted into something almost its intellectual opposite, an arcane, specialist, highly Marxist, which a New Left Review wasn't. It was very open, and as Kellner wrote in an early issue, for example.
Althusserian.
Pardon?
Althusserian. I mean, his influence was obviously quite considerable later on.
Oh, later, yes. And they became quite influenced by Althusser. And that's the point at which Edward Thompson exploded and felt he had to write the blast. And he wrote it, which is, of course, it has faults, but basically I'm certainly on his side, absolutely. So that was the New Left period. That was the result of the Hungarian Revolution and of the decay, disintegration of the Communist Party in this country, which now scarcely exists. It's down to less than 10,000 divided.
Were you influenced or sympathetic with the others who became disillusioned with communism? The two great ones I read are Orwell and Koestler. Had you read either of them?
Oh yes, of course I'd read them. I think I personally would have been much more ready to sympathise with them. Well, first, Orwell in particular, because he did carry on fighting, literally. Edward was always extremely hostile to both those people, and I think partly influenced me, no doubt because I partly deferred to his tremendous charisma and intellectual power.
Edward Thompson.
Edward Thompson. I mean, the most amazing guy. So we never gave Orwell and Koestler much run, and by that time, after all, they have a long, long way from socialism, except some very wretched kind of parliamentary stuff up in the Hampstead. And they were, from our point of view, unspeakable right-wingers. So I think that's really why we we felt no sympathy for them at all. And they were another generation, a totally different experience. And the kinds of explanations, in any case, that they generated in the novels and other works of Stalinism didn't seem to us at all adequate. Powerful as they were, it was creative literature. So no, we weren't influenced by them.
Were you from Hungary, were you beginning to doubt? I mean, what was the sort of central doubt about what had happened in Russia? And was it Stalin, or was it something deeper?
Of course it was something deeper. How could it possibly be any person? It was an institution, or the entire structure of society, especially the role of the party and its dictatorial command over the entire society. The elimination of opposition and the whole bit. Monocentric society, and then that required you to examine why people put up with it, what had happened to the opposition, pulverized brutally, how many millions or tens of millions killed.
When did that When did you begin to realise that?
Oh, only after Hungary, really.
Mm.
Yes, I mean, you certainly say, well, we were blind. So I think I've become a lot more humble since. It forced us into a total re-examination, both not just of that culture, but of our own, and of our own intellectual equipment, of Marxism. And that's when the debate started taking place about socialist humanism and what was wrong with Marxism and what would be something better to take its place. In those period days, I used to write a lot in the my main role actually was as commentator on colonial affairs, anti-colonial affairs, and particularly Africa. And I wrote a very well-known article about Mau Mau, and trying to explain it in terms which converged with what I was going to write later about the cargo cult. In that, I was saying that in order to understand these, to whatever extent one subscribed to the belief in their credibility, these apparently brutal rituals of induction that were practiced, especially as you went further into the higher ranks of the movement, one's got to look at them in terms of kinds of solidarity they were trying to express and to build. And in fact, they were horrific also to the Kikuyu, who were breaking sacred taboos and thereby, as it were, steeling themselves to do anything, like even fight and kill the whites. And it's that kind of line of argument I developed. And then I also wrote on the, against a saint of the liberal establishment, Albert Schweitzer, such pointing out that he wasn't, and at great length. And it brought the house down on my head from the kinds of people who are benevolent and very well-meaning, and to whom he is a saint. I think he's a bloody old colonialist. Although a dedicated man who was given his life, medical service, gave his life in Africa, but his attitudes were appalling. Well, those articles create a lot of attention. Now, that and the whole journal. Now, when is this? This is 56, 57.
Yeah. Yes. In fact, you wanted to say something more about...
Why we've been so stupid.
Yes.
Yes. Well, you really cannot appreciate what Stalingrad was like. I remember going to school earlier, 1940, about May, and the English master who so influenced me said, I shouldn't say this, it's unpatriotic or something, but I cannot see any logical, rational reason why we'll be in a position to have a class next week, because there's nothing to stop the Germans rolling into this country. And one was living through some pretty cataclysmic times, and Stalingrad was the next major nodal event. And it showed us that we've been told for years and years and years that the Red Army was a myth. Tanks are all made of cardboard and they'd collapse if you pushed them. And they fought, and they were evidently made of steel. Also, we've been told for decades that there's a brutal oppression inside the Soviet Union, and the minute the population got the slightest chance, they would rise and revolt against Stalin, and they fought to the death. Now, one can talk about why, but to us it seems to suggest that an awful lot of what we've been told for years and years and years about the Soviet Union was nonsense, propaganda, and these were our heroes defending us from destruction. So I think this is very important to understand about loyalty to the Soviet Union, for people of that generation in particular. That's all I want to say on that.
Right. So then you sail back from Australia. You got a PhD now from ANU in anthropology. You came back looking for a post in anthropology.
I can't say I'm very proud of that PhD, but how could I be? I'd done, about 11 months field work, having no preparation at all. I had to write it between November and... I got on the boat in July, during which time we'd given birth to a new baby, which doesn't help. And up night after night after night. And I wrote it, and I suppose, what's that?
Had Sheila been there with you?
Yeah, she was in the field with me.
How did she find it?
The field? Well, she was very stoical, having no interest really in anthropology, I have to say. And she busied herself with people, human beings, especially the young children. And she always is busy and finds interesting things to do. And but she didn't directly help me. She wasn't any kind of amanuensis, and I wouldn't have wanted her to be.
But she wasn't desperately unhappy, or?
No, she wasn't. Except physically, because the climate in monsoon was awful. But most of the year it was lovely. It was glorious.
And you had a reasonable place to live. Were you in the
Oh,
colonial era of living in a bungalow and this sort of thing, or were you?
well, the Aborigines lived out on the sand, as they always have done, with, at best, if they bothered, what they call shades of paper bark over their heads. Lived in the open. They didn't have water. The protector of Aborigines, Fred Gray, had a beautiful big concrete building with all mod cons, kerosene fridge, cool, etc., and ovens and stoves, everything pretty well. And we were given a room in there. So we were living in a quasi-colonial relationship. It was the only relationship would have been allowed, of course.
But it was still that sort of halfway stage where it was a sort of 9 to 5 thing. I mean, in the evenings it was drinks in a cool room.
Oh, it wasn't that elegantly colonial. I mean, we were, simple North Australians. We wouldn't have had drinks to dish around.
But when one talks about sort of later hair shirt participant observation type of anthropology, we're actually sort of living in the mud hut with a family of the people. You obviously couldn't do that.
No. At night, very, very often, I would go. If I'd hear the didgeridoo going, and I think, I wonder what that's for, and I would go up and chat. Sometimes I just go for sheer sociability to see my friends and informants and so forth. Sit around, talk, play with the kids, and of course then from time to time something significant did happen, like major rituals, and would stay there day and night for as much as possible. But by and large it was visits at night time.
Yes. So Deborah was born just on the way back.
Yes, and according to Aboriginal way of looking at things, she was conceived. She must be belong to the West Wind Para clan, because she was conceived in their territory. I'm naturally the classificative brother of my chief informant. So if she ever goes back, she has a territory and rights.
Does she know this?
She does. She's very proud of it.
One day she'll go back.
And she's been to Australia, unfortunately never got back there. Yes.
Have you been back?
No, I'd ideally like to go. I really wonder whether even now they might let me in. Fred Rhodes has had very considerable difficulty, but Fred is extremely provocative. He courts trouble and he insults the Australian government and all sorts of authorities. I think he wants to show his loyalty to East Germany, where he lives, that he's not being bought over by these bourgeois influences. I don't have to prove anything like that. So I wonder, because subsequent research like David Turner, David, for the most it's been written about, innocent, and he's not a political activist or a difficult person. He offended, however, the missionaries. Probably he wrote things about, they have developed a counter-religious cult of their own, some of them, the minority phenomenon. He's written about that and certain things that maybe the missionaries found as too unacceptable or sensitive. But he was later refused entrance back after his first large period of field work, and this must have been in the, I don't know, 60s, early 70s. Ostensibly now, not refused entrance by the mission, but by the new Aboriginal Council, which I suspect is simply masterminded by the missionaries.
So you haven't been back. Anyway, you're on the boat coming back. You're right.
Coming back from Australia, yes, and hearing about the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu on the way.
Did you? Oh, yeah.
Got back. I looked around for jobs, and of course I'd been at. I'm sorry, I'm getting confused. I'll start again. When I got back, Max. Sorry, I really am. We're in 1956, 54 now.
From your first return from
yes
Australia.
Well, of course, I had gone out as from Manchester as a MA graduate and a protégé of Max Gluckman's. And my dream in life was to get back to be a protégé of Max Gluckman, because it was the most wonderful experience anyone could have had.
Why was that? What was there about Max that was so wonderful? I heard he was an overbearing sort of...
Oh, yes, an authoritarian personality, but a nice guy. He was so intellectually powerful. I mean, his capacity to turn his mind and to turn anthropology to anything was quite, for me at that time, quite astounding. Now, if you'd have asked me to go, I nearly went and worked at the Worsley at one time in a ward of schizophrenics when I was so desperate for a job. I have found it, I think, quite difficult to know how to approach that kind of utterly untraditional research project, a task. Max wouldn't. He had 10 ideas before breakfast. And he proved this, because he actually did start up sociology, or at least anthropological studies of Britain. Tom Lupton was the most best known of these, industrial studies, and Warner later became his wife, and many others, excellent, and urban studies, Derek Alcorn and others. There was a whole core. Now the intellectual, these guys were perfectly competent in their own right, of course, and experienced. Nevertheless, Max, as he did with the anthropology studies, infused them with his own strategies, one might say, ways of looking at things, so that people went into factories looking for fission and fusion and conflict and coherence and symbolic identities and all the clues of what to look for, rather than being told what they would find. And it all turned out damn good work. Different in kind from most sociological work, which is, of course, usually based on much more distant and documentary sources, materials. And although I don't suppose that tradition didn't persist, I can't say it has done, nevertheless, I think those were very, very interesting studies. And that was impressive about Max. And he could turn his mind to contemporary, social and political issues, like the radio broadcasts. And indeed ordinary listeners to the BBC, and even to the third programme, which is regarded as rather an egghead programme, and found this tremendously illuminating and exciting. And they were bestsellers, his books, based on those radio broadcasts, rightly so. Talking about, these are Zande, and they're witchcraft oracles. What on earth would you think any ordinary person would be interested in something like that for? But by the time Max Gluckman had finished, they were. They could see indeed what it was all about. And one of the things they could see was not only that these people were tackling problems that we also have to confront, but tackling them in ways perhaps very different from ours, but equally understandable and rational. And that's one of the great classic anthropological messages. And he was wonderful at that.
He was a good lecturer.
Superb, and he knew it. And he was a superb, in every way, teacher. He could take, doesn't matter if Srinivas had come from India, cultures with which Max was totally unfamiliar. He'd have some way of looking at it, of suggesting perceptions, modes of analysis which the guy would immediately respond to. I'll tell you, a guy who had the same gift was Victor Turner, who was a colleague, a contemporary of mine. I was at Brandeis when Vic arrived to give some lectures, and Vic had been at that time just come back from Mexico, I think for the second time. Short periods in Mexico, but during that time he wrote some very seminal things. They're now debated, very interesting, on pilgrimages and so forth. And Vic gave one of his characteristic lectures, which went on for at least 2 hours, probably 3. Very difficult to stop him, but nobody wanted to stop him because he was entrancing. I've seen him start seminars in Chicago at 11 o'clock at night, and about 3 in the morning I had to go to bed, but the others, graduate students, were sitting on the floor riveted and not missing a full stop. So Vic talked about Mexico, and this was a Mexicanist department at Brandeis. And at the end of his second long lecture, one of them said, "Well, I have to say, so I've been studying Mexico for 14 years," he said, "and at last I've begun to realise how I should go about looking at it." That's a wonderful tribute. And Max had that quality. And he was very democratic. He was authoritarian but democratic. We were a tiny group of apostles. So we would spend all our time together. We'd have coffee together, we'd have lunch together, we'd come. Max used to make us work in his bloody garden like helots. I mean, notorious. But it was close. It was face-to-face interaction with a vengeance. And he also made us interact with each other. If anyone came, as a constant flow of people from northern Rhodesia, Zambia, of people coming from the field, like Victor Turner or Ian Cunnison, not Vic, Bill Watson, and they'd come. There'd be 10 special new seminars put on, and we were in a whirlwind of stuff, and also fresh, brand new, and we were collectively really working on how we can make sense of all this. I remember sitting in particularly Srinivas's, what came out to be the Coorg book, and I knew but nothing about India, though I'd been there. And I found it riveting and absolutely exciting. And we were all involved, and I think we all did, in fact, in different ways, contribute something towards those discussions. And that was wonderful. It was, and although Max and Srinivas were very senior people by then, and with long research experiences behind, they treated us, for all practical purposes, as intellectual equals. Even though there was this authoritarian aspect to Max. Intellectually speaking, it was a different thing altogether.
He was a person who would change his mind if you made a good point to him.
Yes, he would. He would indeed. And he would also, of course, the other important characteristic of supervisors and tutors, he would be very supportive, obviously in practical ways, like finding money, but in encouraging you. I mean, he said to me, put that MA in for a Girl Prize. I would never have dreamed of anything so arrogant. And he said to me, we come to the trumpetful sound, for example. I went back, and I had written my PhD, which was not marvellous. Published a few things on Australian Aborigines in Man and so forth, and American anthropologists. And but I was still bitten by, and somewhat frustrated, because I had prepared myself to go to the New Guinea Highlands and to New Guinea. And the big thing in New Guinea at that time was cargo cults. And I had collected a lot of material. I wasn't, of course, able to go into the field like Peter Lawrence and Ken Burridge, but I discussed with them at great length their field results when they came back and read all their materials. And one weekend, this is typical of Max's yeast-like stimulating role. It was as an outcome of the Mau Mau incident, confrontation with Sir Philip Mitchell. Max became known as the great expert on the Mau Mau, which he didn't know much about, of course. He'd never worked in Kenya. But he was modest. When it came to intellectual matters, he knew when he knew something and when he didn't. So it had given him an interest in movements of protest, especially amongst colonized peoples. And of course, from his African knowledge, going back to his Zulu studies, he knew a lot about similar phenomena in Southern Africa and Central Africa. And he conceived the idea, and he was a man by this time well established in social sciences and popularly known. He meets all sorts of people. He arranged a special weekend. He said, not on the Mau Mau, but he brought Eric Hobsbawm to talk about what became primitive rebels. He got Norman Cohn to talk about his medieval movements, and he got me to talk about cargo cults. By that time I started. It's one of the most exciting weekends I've ever spent in my life. It was marvellous. We just gave 3 papers, I think. That's all. Maybe, I think that's all. And out of that came 3 what I think are cracking books. Eric had always had you wouldn't believe it now, a bit of a blockage about writing. He was known to be a genius and a polymath and spoke 90 languages. There wasn't an awful lot on paper. But he wrote this fascinating set of essays on his Italian millenarian and other kinds of protest movements, and from that moment he never looked back, and books poured out of him. And
what did you do? I mean, can we just pause a moment on Eric?
Yes.
Since we're past. I mean, you mentioned the enormous influence and admiration you have for Edward Thompson. The other person who is of that sort of league, to my mind, is Eric Hobsbawm. Do you
Absolutely.
admire him?
Oh, I think he's marvellous. Yes, yes. He is incredible. I think he gets in some ways better as he goes on. I mean, recent books, which are not in the field of British historiography of the 19th century, brilliant as that trilogy is. I mean, think about The Invention of Tradition. What a mind-blowing, mind-expanding work that is. Also hilariously funny and iconoclastic. Wonderful. And, you know, he's a great jazz man.
I was going to say, you have an interest in jazz.
Indeed, I did. I was a great guy. And nearly at one stage was told I might have become a jazz critic of the New Statesman.
You were?
I know. Eric wasn't he, for a time?
Yes.
Yeah. But, Eric, a great hero, intellectual hero. Amongst Marxists, I would put him and Perry in Britain, and others like Christopher Hill, of course. Now, it's of some interest to say this, Alan, because you're an historian, but I published, was perhaps come to later on, a book on the three wills. Christopher Hill reviewed it in the Guardian. I didn't know he was going to review it. And he said, Peter Worsley's books are triply interesting, he said. The guy is not only an anthropologist, but also a sociologist, and though he probably doesn't know it, he's also has an historical vision. And I think I have, probably because, in part, of my coming under the influence of a wonderful history master at school, and I think we all seem to assume that life starts at university. It doesn't. It starts in school as intellectual life, and I'm very aware of my formative influences there. So, yes, Christopher and the classic school of historians, Rodney Hilton. People like that. But Eric and Edward and Perry, that's my trio.
Yes, there's your
my troika.
And the greatest of them shall be not.
Oh, as a scholar. Well, it would have to be between Perry and Edward and Eric Hobsbawm, because Perry isn't finished yet.
No.
He's quite a young man. There are 2 more volumes, I think, to come, if anything like the first, on that alone. Well, it's really the history of Western European capitalism, isn't it? I think they're magnificent. Yes, so we had this weekend, and out of that, well, I must have started already. I decided I was going to write, not just carry on like Evans Pritchard would do for 10 or 20 years writing about the Nur. I would carry on for 10 or 20 years writing about the Groot Islanders with exiguous field material and equipment in general, and the great difficulty to try to maintain research interest in Australia at the other end of the earth, which I'd only been forced into faute de mieux anyhow. I decided, Max was approached by a young left publishing firm, McGibbon and Key, which has now disappeared, to write a book about the Mau Mau, which was big news, Max Gluckman on the Mau Mau. And he modestly said no, he didn't think he knew enough about it. But he said, I've got a young student here who has got writing a book about something analogous. And that's how Trumpet Shall Sound came.
I suppose it's an obvious point, but there seems to be a shared interest just at that time, just as the sort of last echoes of colonialism was disappearing, with all this and the New Left Review and the Trumpet Shall Sound kind of interest in millenarian movements and nativistic movements all around. Just in the late 50s, early 60s, your excitement of suddenly finding Hobsbawm, Cohn, yourself, and then there's the Thrupp collection, wasn't there?
Yes.
Comparative.
Well, it's what is it? It's colonial resistance, isn't it? And it's this is the period of the disintegration of colonialism. We're just on the eve of the winds of change, 1960. In Africa in particular. It was the dominant form of political action on the part of the ordinary people of Melanesia in the Pacific. I could see that, and had been for 40 or 50 years. So yes, and these are very far removed from the more familiar movements of revolution and resistance, like in Vietnam or Russia or China and so forth, which were largely within the perspective, ideological framework of some Western ideology like Marxism. These weren't. They were utterly different. We had to, but they were very real, very important, and we had to try to come to terms with them intellectually. And I think that's what we're all grappling with.
You said that the thesis of that now looking back, you weren't sure whether you agreed with it.
The trumpet. No, I don't really. The trumpet sound starts off with chapter 1. The formation of the colonial world in New Guinea, of the colonial structure of society, and it deals with the creation of monocentric colonial institutions with the governor at the top, and the plantation system, the economy, political economy. Perfectly valid. When you read years and years later, Peter Lawrence, field worker, produced his carefully thought through book. The first chapter isn't exactly entitled this, but it's what it means. The Melanesian Worldview. Peter Worsley writes a book. The first chapter is political economy, colonialism in this area. Peter Lawrence writes a book called which the first chapter is the Melanesian Worldview. I think they're both right, and both have their shortcomings, because the way I see it now is that it's a dialectic between the two. You certainly have to understand the incredible impact the coming of colonialism, German or Australian or English, meant in New Guinea or anywhere else, and describe it, and explain it. But how do you explain the response to that? Colonialism occurred all over the world. It occurred in South America, in North America, in Asia. In some places the response was liberal in terms of Western liberalism, demand for parliaments and adult suffrage, of native rights. In some places it became socialism, or even later revolutionary Marxism. It took all kinds of forms. So those forms are not dictated by the inherent logic simply of political economy. They were dictated and created, shaped by available cultural materials and ideological frameworks and perspectives, which included cargo cults. Clearly. So both Lawrence, I emphasise one side of the dialectic, Lawrence emphasised the other. Now I think threaded all the way through my book is a quite rich investigation of Melanesian perceptions and modes of understanding and intellectual frameworks. But I myself systematically at the beginning of the book didn't, as the French say, plant that problem quite as clearly as I should have done, and I didn't express it in the form of a dialectical model. I think I now would do. And that's the same kind of auto-critique that I would make of the work on the Talensi, my criticism of Maya Fortes. I think, again, it overemphasized the material dimensions of social life amongst the Talensi, and simply almost treated what Maya talks about in such rich way of the lineage structure of institutions and lineage ideologies and ancestor and earth culture simply as somehow derivative epiphenomena, by-products. It's a base and superstructure model and quite inadequate. So that's what I now think of it.
You probably didn't hear Salin's British Academy lecture recently, but it was really very similar. It's interesting that he took Melanesia and he took China, and he suggested, as a lot of his recent work has done, the way in which Western capitalism, if you take the idea of diffusion of Western capitalism in something that concerns you later in the Wallerstein model, as just sweeping everything before it and having the same effects, it's nonsense. You've got to see it as this dialectical process whereby it's interpreted by Macartney's mission and those who met Macartney and those in the islands, in each case differently, and it has a different effect in each case.
Absolutely. I think McCartney mission is a classic statement. It's on page 1 of my Third World. I first ran across it in Canada and I was bowled over at the heliocentric arrogance of this emperor who was actually wrong. Wonderful contempt for the West. And people come to me with these kinds of one-way models of basically periphery, centre periphery. I think there's one word Iran. Explain the Ayatollah Khomeini in terms of your political economy. And they cannot. There's no way they can. They've got to start talking about Islam. Thank you very much.
So, you came back, we'll go back to nitty-gritty, you came back and you looked to Max for hoping to be able to rejoin him.
Yeah.
But?
Well, I wrote The Trumpet Shall Sound, very successful. I was extremely lucky. It was reviewed by Gora, Jeffrey Gora in The Observer, and he said, wonderful book. The Guardian praised. I think by this time I was reviewing for The Guardian. I think that arose because I had the Elboy Network. A guy who'd known me at Cambridge as an anthropologist had become it was on the staff of The Guardian. I think he recommended me as a reviewer of anthropology, and I started, and I did dozens and dozens of reviews for The Guardian. I became quite well known that way. And they've tended to peter out over the years, and I think when they're desperate, they fill up with something. They occasionally send for me, but very rarely. But I enjoyed that. The money was very welcome too. I was impoverished, but